Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplanty Goodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today it's going to be a continuation of the plant review series, and today's plant I don't actually have in front of me, and there's a story behind that, but I will be interspersing both pictures and videos throughout the video, and it will make more sense as we go through it. But the plant I'm going to be talking about today is the Philodendron verrucosum. Now, before I dive into things any further, for the people that are returning, as always, you know where you can find the chapters if you want to skip to your favorite bit. And for anybody that's joining that's new, welcome to the slight insanity that is my channel. And just a bit of groundworks. There is no way of basically making these review series videos without them being biased. They will be biased. It's my experience with my plants in my conditions. And at the moment, it tends to be in the UK, in a conservatory with humidity levels. That means with the cold, with the grey, and all of the above. Obviously in the summer it's slightly different, but at the moment we're coming into autumn. So diving into a bit of background on the Philodendron verrucosum, and hopefully I'll be able to add a picture here of when I first got my second Philodendron verrucosum. I think at that point I had a much smaller plant that I bought myself, and this plant was gifted to me, which was lovely. It's like a very dear friend who is in the planty business. They're no longer in the planty business, but they decided to give me this plant, which obviously I was super, super grateful. And it was a spectacular plant, possibly one of the largest, quote unquote, rare back then philodendrons that I had added to my collection. I think the first Philodendron verrucosum that I added to my collection, the much smaller one, and I'll see if I can find a picture of that. I'm not entirely sure. I might have to troll back on my Instagram because I'm pretty sure that I don't have it on my plant care app. For the people that have been here for a while, they know that I list most of my plants on my plant care app because it makes it easier. I've got some really janky pictures on my plant care app, but what happens usually if I don't have a plant anymore in the collection, they get removed, so I lose those images as well. So I'll see if I can find one from the Instagram and add it here. So that original plant I got, I'd say at least 3 to 4 years ago. This other larger plant was gifted to me either 2 or 3 years ago, but the video title will have the duration of the larger plant. I will talk about the larger plant predominantly during this video, and throughout I might link at the top. I've done a couple of other videos with updates on the big plants, so you should be able to see from there. But yeah, essentially the story behind this was that it was gifted to me. It was quite a large specimen. When I first got it, however, because I'm pretty sure this plant is a plant that came over from the Netherlands, from plant nurseries there, they were using straight up coco coir as a soil mix. It was dense, to say the least. It was never drying out. And I was sitting there going, oh, you know what, I've got this. I've got my little verrucosum. I've been able to propagate it quite a few times and done a really good job at that. That didn't go to plan, and it will all kind of make sense as we kind of talk through the video. But yeah, essentially one of the first things that I wanted to do with that, because it was in a plastic pot, it was in horrible soil. Spoiler, maybe I should have left it in the soil. I think it was quite an established plant, and I've got more aware of this with some of my larger plants when they establish in a specific growing media, whether or not it's my own growing media or whether or not I'm buying a much more mature specimen from a plant store or from a seller or anything like that. Generally speaking, the more mature the specimen is and the more established it is in that pot, I won't necessarily remove all of the soil or any of the soil. I might repot it when it needs repotting and start moving it into my own growing media, because I have found the bigger the plants are, the more of a hissy fit they will throw if you change their medium entirely. Basically, smaller, more juvenile plants tend to be a bit better and they tend to roll with the punches a bit more. The bigger plants really, really don't like it. At least that's been the case in my experience. But yeah, plant came to me in perfect condition. It was really, really good. It was a bit floppy, so instead of them having it climbing, they had it flopping down. So I've got a picture here and you can see how it was when I first got it. So it was a bit more of a cascading one. And then the second picture that I'll add here is when I finally added it onto a trellis. I had to buy a very, very robust metal trellis that you would normally use for the garden. That trellis itself was quite pricey, but in order to kind of truss it up, because it was a very, very heavy plant at that point. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say in terms of the background on this plant and how it came into my care. Moving on to speed of growth. Now, anybody who's got a Verrucosum, and I use rare when it comes to describing the Verrucosum. It used to be much, much harder to find. It was still not one of the hardest plants to find a few years back. There's been a lot more of it that have flooded into the market. That also gives you an indication of the speed of growth on this plant. It is one of the fastest growing philodendrons that I have in my collection, barely. And by barely, I mean barely have in my collection. So that will make sense. But yeah, it's a relatively stable grower. It will kind of push out new leaves all the time. It's not one of the philodendrons that will tend to get caterpillars that get stuck a lot of the time. So it does grow quite nicely. And yeah, I think if I'm benchmarking it against the golden pothos that I would normally do, so if a golden pothos in the summer might bring out 2 or 3 leaves, the Philodendron verrucosum will either match that or just be slightly under that. So it's a relatively fast philodendron generally. Obviously, the larger the specimen, the more it will grow consistently and faster. Obviously, the smaller, when I started with a much smaller verrucosum, it did take a while to kind of get it going, but when it did, it just kind of did its thing, really. So onto ease of propagation. So ease of propagation for this, easy. This is definitely one of the easiest philodendron that I've got in my collection when it comes to propagating. I don't think I have ever tried water propagation with this. I would imagine it would do well. If you've done water propagation with your verrucosum, do let us all know down below how that went. I'm kind of dubious a bit with that one because out of a lot of the philodendrons that we've got in collections, this one has got relatively thin roots. It's not got particularly succulent roots, which also kind of explains when I first got it why the grower was growing it in pure coir. So yeah, but I've tried it in perlite to propagate, worked well. I've tried it in damp sphagnum moss, worked well. Pretty sure I've also tried it, no, the one that I've got growing at the moment is directly propagated onto pon. That worked really well. So generally speaking, not a particularly difficult plant. Now, and this is where the, the juice of the story comes in about the big plant. It struggled. It struggled the most as I think of most of my other plants. And actually, if I was to pinpoint where my mealybug issues in this conservatory started, was that plant, basically. So it was the first one that got a lot of mealybugs. We'll talk about that in the pest section. But yeah, and it started from there, and I've been dealing with mealybugs in here since then. Another big bit of information for you here, that big plant does not exist in any way or form at the moment, still in my care. To the point that at some point it just got so badly infested, I had to chop it down and propagate it. That's why I know that it propagates so well, because pretty much every single propagate that I got from that plant did well. I kind of gave it to people who wanted verrucosum. So it's a relatively straightforward philodendron to propagate. Does it do well in household humidity? Kind of. So it's one of those ones that I had in household humidity when it was large. It did okay. It was growing over a radiator and it was still kind of okay. Did it do better in a conservatory with higher humidity? Obviously, it is a tropical plant. It will appreciate the humidity, but I don't think it's necessary for it. There is other reasons when it comes to pests that might make the humidity necessary, but I'll touch on that on the pest section. But generally, yeah, very easy to propagate and very fast to propagate as well. So availability with this plant is interesting. I've kind of mentioned it a bit earlier on in the video. It was harder to find for sure, and it was very hard to find established versions of this plant. There was, at least, I can talk about where I'm based. So I'm based in the UK, and I can talk a bit more about the UK and the European market, basically. And as I said, probably around the beginning of the pandemic or just before, we saw an influx of varicosums that were potentially being released from the Netherlands at that point. I'm pretty sure my one came from a nursery in the Netherlands, and it's an interesting one because with the varicosum, when I got my first one, it's before there was that influx from the plants coming in from the growers from the Netherlands. It wasn't the easiest thing to find. It wasn't the most expensive thing to find. I think I got a one-leaf cutting, rooted cutting. I'm not even entirely sure if I got it from the rare plant store. It might have been one of my first purchases. I'm not entirely sure. It wasn't insanely expensive. It was kind of mid double digits, basically. Not for a very established plant. Ironically enough, now for mid double digits or maybe slightly higher, you can get a very large, possibly not as large as mine, but quite a substantial plant for that kind of money now. And when I'm talking now, it would have been quite a juvenile single leaf cutting or rooted cutting back then. So yes, it has dropped in price. Yes, there's a lot more of them available. I'm seeing them a lot more often. I'm also seeing them sometimes now in more specialist plant stores and kind of garden centers. And even the ones that are not just carrying rarer plants, this might be there for a soiree to bring into something that's a bit more different and unusual, basically. Now, the reason why I think it has dropped in price, barring the fact that it does propagate quite easily, as we looked at in the previous section, there are a lot of issues with this plant when it comes to pests, or generally issues. I mean, it's a beautiful plant, don't get me wrong, and it's a shame because it is such an interesting philodendron. It is quite different. It has got those velvety leaves. I found with my leaves that, and I think this happens generally with most varicosums, if you hit it in the right kind of light, it's got a slight pubescence or fuzziness on the leaf, which kind of gives it a bit of a silvery iridescence when the light hits it, which is beautiful. And it's obviously got the red on the back of the leaves. I've seen in a lot of different growers, either from Indonesia or Ecuador, that have actually got different kind of types of varicosum, and I can't think of all of them at the moment. They're ones that have got much deeper reds at the back. I think mine's the Philodendron varicosum insigne or something along those lines. I'll see if I can remember and add it up there. But yeah, so there's different types of Philodendron varicosum, but I think it's more how they've been selectively grown to show that, rather than, I think they're not kind of standalone plants in their own right. They're all still Philodendron varicosum, essentially. I might be wrong about this. If you know different, do let me know in the comments down below. I'm sure you will, but do let me know down below. But yeah, it is one of those ones that has come into the market. I think part of the reason, as I was talking about, the price has gone down because of how easy it is to propagate. So the market flooded quite a bit of it. And because, and I will say the same thing that everybody else says, it is a spider mite magnet. So a lot of people that have had a chance to get it probably haven't kept it happy for too long, or they kind of fall out of love with it quite quickly, which, to be fair, is probably my experience with this plant as well. But yeah. Moving on to pests, and this is going to be the big topic for this specific plant. Anybody who's got a varicosum probably will not be surprised by this. So yes, it is a spider mite magnet. There is no two ways around that. And I will say, and this is the point I was trying to make before, that you might want to have it in slightly higher humidity for pest reasons. It's predominantly for the spider mites. Now, the interesting thing that I found with my varicosum, both the large one and the smaller one that I had prior to the larger kind of behemoth of one that I got given, is that predatory mites that will kind of hunt down and feed on the spider mites worked really well actually with that one. So I didn't struggle with spider mites for too long after I got the predatory mite satchels onto the plant itself, even when it was growing in a household humidity. The interesting thing, and again, this was the first plant that taught me this when it comes to the other big pests that I had with this plant, which was the mealybugs, was I'd kind of assumed, because the petiole of this plant is quite fuzzy. Now, some of the petioles, when they're new leaves, usually on propagates, or when they're kind of coming in and they're a bit more juvenile, you might not get the fuzziness on that entirety of the petiole. It might just be at the point where the leaf attaches to the petiole, and the rest of it just might be like a regular petiole, kind of smoothish. There's still a bit of texture, if I'm not mistaken. But I'd kind of assumed, you know what, it's got a fuzzy petiole. It's quite difficult for those mealybugs to get in between those little kind of hairs or trichomes to be able to attach to the plant. Boy, oh boy, was I wrong. That does not apply. So they definitely did get onto the petiole. Ironically enough, with that plant, where sometimes in some of my other kind of foliage plants that I have in the conservatory, the mealybugs will attach to the leaf itself sometimes. On the Verrucosum, it was predominantly not just on the petiole itself, but where the petiole attaches to the leaf. And I don't know whether or not mealybugs are a common issue. I know spider mites are a common issue for a lot of people with this plant, but mealybugs were the big one for this one with me. I don't know if it just happened and it's not a plant that would normally get it. As I said, I had assumed because of those trichomes, it would be a bit of an inhospitable environment for the mealybugs to attach comfortably. So I didn't think it was going to get it. So by the time I'd clocked and seen enough of the mealybugs, it was quite difficult, because anybody who's tried to take mealybugs off a plant with kind of like a Q-tip and rubbing alcohol, and you need to scrape them off, it can become very difficult to get all of that off when it's very, very fuzzy, especially when the plant is as large as that was. So yeah. This also harkens to the fact as well, when a plant doesn't particularly bring you any joy anymore, and you tend to put it in a position where I'm just going to leave it there. I'll keep watering it and I'll keep making it survive, but I'm not really going to bother too much about it. And that's what I did. And it was right behind, whilst me trying not to basically chuck my monkey pitcher plant down, it was right behind me there against the window behind the shelf. So I still had access to water it, but not enough that I would ever really be looking at it quite regularly or treating it. And I think, as I said, by that point, I was already kind of over the plant, really, because I'd struggled with these pests for so long. So yeah, that was my experience. Thrips wise, I don't think I ever had thrips, or maybe in the very end when the plant was just giving up the ghost at that point because it'd been struggling with pests for so long. But yeah, generally it was spider mites to begin with, but for me, predominantly, it was mealybugs. Moving on to accessories and kind of general care for this plant. So obviously, I'll bring up the picture yet again, and you can see a trellis or some support sticks or a moss pole would be much appreciated for this plant. You can let it trail. As I said, when I got mine, it was trailing. It was still sizable leaves. So for me, that kind of implies that it can still size up on its leaves, even if we've not really given it something to support it up. I would assume it would take a bit longer for the leaves to size up, but it does happen, and it will still get relatively large leaves. At least that has been in my experience. It doesn't even need to attach too much. The clips that I'm interspersing from my last remaining Verrucosum is one tiny chunk propagate that I had, that I still propagated, and I've kind of got it to grow in a really awkward place in essentially what is the utility room. It's got a window. Touch wood, it hasn't had any spider mites and it hasn't had any mealybugs yet. And it seems to be generally happy, and it is in pon. And for the length of the plant itself, it's in the tiniest little pon container and it's still doing okay. I do almost always have a water reservoir in for that plant, because the one thing I have learnt from growing my other Verrucosum, and as I said, disturbing the soil, the roots are as fine as it was, it tends to not want to be in boggy soil, but it wants to have availability towards moisture quite a bit. At least that has been in my experience. It also is probably why some of the spider mites are staying away from it as well, because it's not really drying out in any way or form. And I don't know whether I've ever mentioned this before on my channel, but if you find a place that a plant likes and it's doing well there and it hasn't done well anywhere else, leave it. Leave it there, basically. It seems to be doing good there. And again, if you're struggling with a plant and you think it's the location that's the issue, try moving it around slowly, because you don't want to keep shocking it, basically, because that will cause other issues. But keep moving it around until you find its happy place. Because there's a lot of things that I've said and a lot of other people that have said about light levels and all of these things, but it's not always the same. Certain light levels, there might be a tree in front of the window, so you might be getting some dispersed light coming in at different times of the day, and that plant might appreciate it. So, but yeah, so it is one of those things that one specifically, the small one I'm pointing, because that's where that room is essentially, is not got any support sticks. It's kind of leaning against the window a bit, so it's getting a bit of support from there and between the other plants as well. But it seems to be doing well, and I kind of keep leaving it there. Does it need all of these things? Probably not. I've grown it in plastic pots and it did all right. I've grown it in terracotta pots and it did all right. I've grown it in a net pot and it did all right. Most of these things were fine, but the moisture level, kind of keeping it more consistent within that soil, I found that specific philodendron wanted it more than anything else. But that also taught me that the kind of plants that I want are ones, especially when you're looking at kind of things like philodendron, I don't want to have to water them almost to the same level that I would do a fern. And that one for me was very fern-like, because if you look at the roots, and this might have been me, I don't know whether or not my roots on my plant struggled for a long time. If you kind of unpotted a verrucosum and you've seen that it's got exceptionally chunky roots, tell me that I'm talking rubbish. I'm happy to be corrected on this one. But from what I saw, it is very fine roots. So yeah, I think that's the big thing in terms of care and accessories for me. So moving on to a final thoughts from this, and I don't think most of you are going to be surprised by some of the scores that I'm going to give to this. So knowing what I know now, that's what I usually do, knowing what I know now, if I didn't have this plant, would I buy this? No, not even if they paid me. I do have it, it's still going. Will I be sad if that one remaining kind of chunk that's grown has actually died? Probably not. And this is what a lot of my plants do sometimes, but I'm just like, I don't really want it anymore, but then I've still got one remaining one and I keep watering it, and it's almost there to spite you of going, no, I will do okay now, and I will just keep on going until you get bored of me and give me to somebody or put me to the great compost bin in the sky. But yeah, no, I wouldn't do that to myself again. Do not get me wrong, I still think this is a beautiful plant. If it didn't have all the pest issues, if I didn't find it, and again, this is just my experiences, your experiences might differ entirely, and if it does, tell us down below how long you've had your plant for, what the care is that you're giving to your plant, what your conditions are like, because if somebody else is struggling and they really want to make this house plant happy, I don't really care anymore, they might be quite interested in finding out what they need to do. But yeah, definitely not one that I would add to my collection again, because I'm still dealing with the mealybug issue that started from that original plant. Again, my negligence, not the plant's fault. Years later, nearly 2 years later, so no. And moving on to the second part of the score, and again, you probably won't be surprised from this, from 0 or 1 being the worst up until 10, I would probably give this a 0 or a 1. I think there was only one other plant that I've given a score like that, and I'm trying to remember which one it was at the moment. It may have been the Pastazanum. I think that was the one that I gave quite a bad score. Update on that one, I'm kind of looking at it now. I've moved it into soil, and it's doing a lot better. Should have just done that to begin with. Not everything will like pon, and I think that's the thing that most people, because sometimes people come to me and they're just like, you've got a lot of these things in ponds, and how are you making everything survive? I'm just like, I can't make everything survive in pond. Another thing as well, and I'll give you this tip for free, I have never been able to get an alocasia to be entirely happy in pond. And to be fair, at this point, after trying for as long as I have, I'm giving up on that one. I will be moving or keeping alocasias in soil from now on, basically. I know they can do well with leca, but I didn't get on well with leca. But Yeah, as a whole, I know I've really poo-pooed on this plant. I will say the same thing again. I still think it's a very attractive plant. The red backs on the leaves, the fuzzy petioles, the kind of slight shimmer to the front of the leaves, it ticks a lot of boxes. It's an easy grower, it's easy to propagate. And I might go on a limb here and say, do I think this is the most adapted plant to household conditions? Probably not, because of the pest issues and because of all these other parameters. If this is a plant, and I think this might end up becoming one of those plants that is in circulation for a while, and you get kind of selective breeding to plants that might be more pest resistant and all these things, and they kind of take out some of these niggles. Do I think this could become the next pothos or anything like that? Possibly. I think there is potential for this plant because it is a different plant. It is an interesting plant. There's more that could be sent from it. It's not as expensive anymore. If the growers over the next few years can get it to be a bit hardier, then yes, I think potentially this plant could be one of those because it ticks a lot of the boxes. It's just, it falls short just at the very end, at least for me. So I think this is enough of a negative review from my point. As I always say, if you've got differing opinions, or even if you've got the same opinions, do let people know down below. Hopefully this will become a repository where people can find information about what it's like growing a plant out for a few years. Yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.